Now, your current assignment is at the branch office in Korea. How long have you been serving there?
Well, if you count the first 1.5 years I served at Bethel, that would be 9.5 years. I say that because I was reassigned. I actually left Bethel to go to prison.
Well, now, that's not something we typically hear as a reason for leaving Bethel, is it? What happened?
You see, in South Korea, all males become eligible for military conscription when they turn 19, and a draft notice comes sometime after that. As for us Jehovah's Witnesses, because we refuse military service, the result would be a 1.5 year sentence in prison, but you may not go right away.
Now, that's interesting. What would be the factors that would determine when your prison sentence would actually begin?
From the time you receive a draft notice until you actually go to prison, especially in recent times, that time period was unknown and different for each brother. A lot depended on the judge you get. As for me, I had to wait 5 years from the time I first appeared in the court until I finally went into prison. I had to make a choice as to how I was going to spend my time. Do I use that time just staying at home, doing nothing, planning nothing, since I could go into prison at any moment? Or do I use that time to earn some money for the time when I'm finally released from prison? Or do I use my life to the full, pursuing spiritual things first while I could do so freely? So I decided to pioneer. I also volunteered at the International Convention. Here I'm welcoming the delegates as they arrive to their hotels. I also got even accepted to Bethel. Here I'm working in my assignment. And here are the brothers and sisters working in the computer department where I work.
How nice.
Pioneering and Bethel service really helped me to prepare my heart for the time when the call finally came to go to prison. And it was during this period that I really grew spiritually.
Well, I guess pioneering and Bethel can have that positive effect on a person, can't it?
So we're hearing from Sung-hee Lee, who again is one of the students for the 149th Gilead class, and he is giving his experience, which mostly involves the matter of conscientious objection. For those of you who don't know, South Korea, until recently, jailed young Jehovah's Witness men who refused to join the country's military. In fact, over 18,000 Jehovah's Witness men have been imprisoned in that country over the last 60 years. It's no longer happening, thankfully, because the Korean authorities recognize that they need to come up with some kind of solution that will not criminalize people for following their religious beliefs. If any religious minority decides that it's against their beliefs to take up arms, obviously it's the responsibility of the country to come up with a solution that will allow them to satisfy their security needs while at the same time not violating people's religious rights. The one thing I would say about this whole matter, and I've said it before on this channel, is that there are some things that you don't really hear or don't really come across. The one thing I would say about this matter of conscientious objection as it pertains to Jehovah's Witnesses is that we don't really hear the full story whenever this matter is touched upon. You heard there Sung-hee Lee referring to the fact that young Jehovah's Witness men have been jailed for up to 1.5 years due to refusing military service. What you won't have heard is that the military offers conscientious objectors the opportunity to do their service without fighting. In those instances, you can end up with, I don't know, some kind of desk job, I guess, where you're not required to go out and shoot people, or it's not likely that you'll ever be in a situation where you need to take another human being's life. What you are required to do is do 5 weeks of basic training, so learning how to clean and fire a weapon, doing assault courses, basically being trained as a soldier and in the art of warfare. You're not killing anyone, you're just learning how to be a soldier. Jehovah's Witnesses object to doing that because they say this contradicts Isaiah 2 verse 4, where it says they will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. They say, well, if it says in Isaiah that they, Jehovah's people, won't even learn war anymore, then this means that Jehovah's Witnesses can't even do the basic training, which of course is not what Isaiah 2 verse 4 is saying. It's using prophetic language to describe the prosperity and peace of God's people in ancient times. It's not suggesting that it's a sin to even learn how to use a sword or a weapon, but that's the extent to which Jehovah's Witnesses follow Bible verses when it comes to their views on pacifism. And let's be clear, I can relate fully to those who are pacifists and who don't want to be involved in warfare. I wouldn't describe myself as a pacifist necessarily, but I can understand why some people feel that way. I just feel it's fanatical to suggest that it's better for young men like Sung Hee Lee, and again, there have been over 18,000 Sung Hee Lees when you think about it, over the past 60 years. I think it's unreasonable and fanatical to suggest that these men, it's better for them to spend a year and a half in jail than to do those 5 weeks of basic training where they're again crawling through mud and assembling and firing weapons, even if that's all it is, and they're then doing a desk job, or they're then doing something that doesn't call upon them to kill anyone or be violent in any way. I feel it's fanatical, and I feel it's frankly irresponsible of the organization to be putting literally thousands of young men in that position. And South Korea is just one country in which this has been the case. I find it interesting that in this particular interview, they seem to skirt over the fact that it was a year and a half. A year and a half is a big chunk of someone's life. That's a huge chunk of your young life. It's time you will never get back again. And goodness knows how Sung Hee Lee will feel if he ever wakes up from his indoctrination and realizes he effectively lost a year and a half of his young life for no reason.
Do you mind talking about how life was for you in prison?
There were definitely moments when I felt anxious, but my 3 fleshly brothers and many other Korean brothers, they also served their time in prison. And their choices and experiences helped me decide how I was going to spend my time in prison. So I decided to make a list right away, what to do while I'm in prison. I made some spiritual goals, such as reading Proclaimer's book and reading other publications. And a group of about 7 to 8 brothers in the same prison cell, we discussed the daily text together every day. And in the evening, we called it evening worship, similar to morning worship in Bethel.
Well, that was certainly wise use of the time that you had there. What can you tell us about the current situation in South Korea for our brothers in connection with military service?
Just a few months ago, the authorities adopted alternative service for proven conscientious objectors. Under this arrangement, you are not labeled as a convicted criminal, and you don't live in a prison cell, but live in a more communal living arrangement. But there is one thing about this alternative service. Instead of your prison sentence being a year and a half, you have to do alternative service for 3 years.
Wow, okay, double the time. You know, our hearts really go out to our brothers and our sisters that have served time in prison for righteousness' sake. But you were able to complete your prison sentence. What was next for you once you were a free man?
Without hesitation, I immediately filled out another application to return to Bethel, and I was accepted to return to Bethel.
Well, good for you. We're glad that worked out.
I find it interesting that it wasn't enough that he was in prison for doing what was expected of him as a Jehovah's Witness and forsaking this option that he had of just doing the 5 weeks of basic training and again getting some kind of desk job where he wouldn't have to fight and he could basically stay a pacifist. It wasn't enough that he had to lose a year and a half of his young life. He also had to figure out ways of basically serving the organization even in his prison cell, to the point where he was following this routine, this regimen of strengthening his indoctrination, reading certain Jehovah's Witness books, brushing up on the organization's history, doing daily Bible reading. It's just sad that to add insult to injury, more was expected of him than simply doing his year and a half. Now, as he mentions, the Korean government have given a bit more flexibility. If you're a Jehovah's Witness, you can now do alternative service, albeit for 3 years rather than a year and a half. And Jehovah's Witnesses in that country will be expected to do 3 years of very unpleasant jobs. And later on in this inside story, we're going to learn what sort of job you might do if you're doing this alternative service. But again, I feel that there is scope for some perspective here, because if you watch my video on the Mexico-Malawi scandal, you will know that during the, I'm going to say 50s and 60s, Jehovah's Witnesses in Mexico were allowed to essentially bribe officials for a cartilla card, which meant that they were part of the country's reserves. They were effectively on the list of reserves for if Mexico went to war, they would be expected to fight for the country. Mexican Jehovah's Witness men were allowed to obtain this document by bribery, while during the same period, or in an overlapping period, witnesses in Malawi were supposed to refuse a card that identified them as part of the country's ruling party, a country where there was a dictatorship, there was no democracy, and every citizen had to have this card identifying that they were essentially a citizen under the rule of this single ruling party. Witnesses in Malawi were supposed to reject this card, were supposed to not buy it, even though this led to many of them, well, I'm not sure I can say on YouTube what happened, but many of them received unspeakable abuse, and some were even killed as a result of taking this stand in the name of Christian neutrality, while witnesses in Mexico were allowed to bribe officials for a card that meant that they ended up in the country's reserves. And here we're learning about Sung Hee Lee spending a year and a half in jail, again over this issue of Christian neutrality. Well, what about the witnesses in Mexico who were effectively signing up to the country's reserves by getting that cartilla card, bribing officials for that cartilla card? I wonder what Sung Hee Lee would think, or how he would react if he understood the double standard here, if he knew that at one point in the organization's history, young men in Mexico were allowed to effectively sign up to the military, while he had gone through a year and a half in jail for refusing to have even the slightest thing to do with his country's military.
You had mentioned that there was one thing in particular that was especially helpful to you, that helped you endure that difficult time in prison. Do you mind telling us about it?
Of course. Many brothers and sisters around the world, they wrote to us brothers in prison. And I personally received a number of them. In fact, I brought them some of them here right here with me. That someone who never met me, who never knew me, wrote such an encouraging, comforting letters.
Yes.
It really warmed my heart and really comforted me. It made me feel that I'm never alone wherever I am in the world, and that I was part of a very special, close, loving, international brotherhood. So I read them over and over again, and I saved all of these letters.
Oh, that is so encouraging, Sung-hee. But I have to ask you, why did you bring these letters with you to New York?
Actually, some of these letters came from Bethelites right here at World Headquarters. I wanted to meet them in person and tell them how much I appreciated all those letters and prayers and how they really helped me to get through my time in prison.
Well, we could certainly understand if those would have been some tearful reunions for you.
Through these experiences, I'm absolutely confident that Jehovah both hears and answers our prayers when we are faced with choices. And also, I am confident that by means of the prayers that were offered in my behalf, Jehovah helped me to stick to the choices that I had made, to stay loyal to Him. So please keep praying for our brothers in prison wherever they are in the world, and please keep writing them letters.
Well, I can assure you, Sung-hee will continue to do just that.
This is a great example of the organization using emotional reasoning. And don't get me wrong, I think it's terrible that young Korean Jehovah's Witnesses have been expected to go through this. Again, there's another side to the story, and the whole thing was fairly needless. And this was an extreme position that was taken by the organization. In my view, young Jehovah's Witness men didn't need to go through that year and a half in jail. They could have just done the basic training, got the desk job, and they would have gone through their military service without killing anyone, essentially remaining pacifists. The organization forced them to take this extreme position based on Isaiah 2 verse 4, that resulted in them losing a chunk of their young lives. Even so, I still think it's wrong that the Korean government took so long to address this situation. And yes, I do think that governments have a responsibility to uphold people's human rights, including human rights of freedom of worship. I don't agree with that extreme position based on Isaiah 2 verse 4. Oh, we can't even learn how to do warfare. I don't agree with that position, but nonetheless, it's still a belief. It's a wrong belief, but it's still a religious belief. And it's the duty of any government to come up with ways of satisfying their needs, of satisfying their security needs without trampling people's human rights. When they don't do that, when they fail to act responsibly, when they do violate human rights, look at how groups like Jehovah's Witnesses leap on it for emotional propaganda purposes. As I've said many times before on this channel, if you can appeal to people's emotions, then you can bypass entirely their critical thinking faculties, and you don't need to logically explain anything. We've learned nothing in this interview about the merits of the Jehovah's Witness theology and why it's true. We've only heard a stirring story about a young man who was spending time in jail on a matter of principle, who was showing his loyalty to a religious organization. That's what Jehovah's Witnesses will be taking away from this. For me, it's direct and overt manipulation of emotional stories as a means of coercing people.